Aliza, thank you so much for joining SheLeads today. I am so excited to just talk to you more, learn from you. So thank you so much. I'm excited to have you on the show.
Oh my God, thanks for asking me. Happy to be here.
Of course. So Aliza, you are the founder and president of Leave Your Mark LLC, a consultancy in creative brand marketing, content development, and digital strategy. And you have a book and podcast titled Leave Your Mark as well, which, by the way, I love that name. And your podcast is so great, so I recommend anyone to listen to it. You talk to so many accomplished people, and it's awesome. And then your book has been noted one of the best career development books of all time. So I'm going to have to get it, given that I'm just coming out of college and I need that advice, so I'm excited. And even prior to all of this, you have 20 plus years experience in the fashion industry, starting off in magazines, going to PR, and then you worked for Donna Karen for 17 years, and you became the head of global communications, but probably most notably, you were DKNY PR girl, which I'm excited to learn more about and hear your experience. So yeah, Aliza, just thank you so much for coming. I'm excited to hear from you and everything.
Happy to be here. Cool. Tell me what I can share.
Yeah, so take me back to when you were my age, and maybe a little bit before. So from my understanding, you didn't think that there could be a career in fashion, and it was more so you even wanted to be a plastic surgeon, from my understanding. So tell me about this experience and how you shifted and almost just your career trajectory leading to Donna Karen.
Sure. So listen, I grew up in the 80s, right? So when we, even in high school, when we met with our guidance counselors pre-college, there wasn't really an education on the breadth of careers that were out there. It was more of a traditional path of like doctor, lawyer, teacher. And I had always loved fashion. I grew up with my room wallpapered in magazine editorial. Loved to shop, of course. And I just kind of thought it was a hobby and didn't really put too much thought into how a magazine comes together or even the design process. So I was really interested in science. I was good in science, and I was also artistic. So I thought, well, maybe if I can be a plastic surgeon, I can combine those two things. So I went to school and I majored in neurobiology and physiology. Yeah. And I took that all the way through. I mean, I graduated with a degree in that. However, in my junior year, I did a very intense internship at a hospital, which showed me that if this was going to be my everyday life, I probably wasn't going to be that happy. So I had to pivot. And I think that one of the biggest things I think that happens to students when they sort of commit to a path and then all of a sudden realize that they don't want to go on that path anymore, it's really scary to be like, whoa, now what, right? And of course, my parents were very like, okay, well, what's your plan B? And I didn't really have a plan B. So luckily, they were supportive, though, and I decided my senior year, and obviously older and more knowledgeable about options in fashion by then, and I thought, well, I want to work in a magazine. So I ended up getting an internship. I went to the University of Maryland. I ended up getting an internship at Washingtonian Magazine, which was a regional magazine, in sales. And I hated sales. But I was smart enough and curious enough, and I think curiosity is really an ingredient to success, to make friends with people in other departments at the magazine, to ask them what they do, to understand how the entire thing came together, and how each person contributed. And I realized I really liked editorial, and I liked the power of editorial, to be able to give your opinion, to write a review, to do all of these things that seemed really interesting, and I loved writing. So I decided, so when everyone was sort of planning graduation / Europe trips after college, I realized I have no fashion experience. I didn't intern anywhere that is relevant to what I wanted to do, which was work at a fashion magazine. So I decided to forego that trip and instead apply to an internship. And I ended up getting one at Harper's Bazaar in accessories. Yeah. And just, to share, obviously my resume was not stellar. I mean, it was totally unrelated, but I was really honest in my cover letter about how I had grown up loving fashion and thought I was going to go on this path to be a doctor, and then made a pivot. And I was really hoping that they can help me get the experience that I was lacking. And I think the honesty and sincerity of that letter really resonated with the people who were hiring, because clearly there were probably tons of candidates who had more direct experience than me. And yet I got the internship. So that was really lucky too. I did that. That sort of put me on my path to work in accessories at Mary Claire. I did that for 2 years. And then at that point, I had an incredible boss and realized that I had taken on so much that I felt more senior than my title. And I felt like I should move up. But there really wasn't an opportunity to get promoted. So I started to look into adjacencies, which I think right now, as you're graduating and sort of probably have in your mind a certain path that you're going on, I think it's important to be flexible and open-minded in the way that you think about what your first job is going to be, because it may not be exactly what you pictured, but given the world's crisis right now.
Yeah.
So that's sort of how I ended up at Donna Karen, and so that's sort of the trajectory.
Yeah, it's such a cool story. I love it.
Thank you.
First, just as you were going and getting these internships and these jobs at these magazines, did you ever have doubts, being like, "Oh no, I shouldn't have left all of that, and that's more security," or were you just like, "No, I'm so happy I did this. This is the right thing"?
The minute I got to that first internship at Bazaar, I was like, I am home. Amazing. Like, it was 100% the right decision. Now, I have questioned over the years, should I have left editorial? There was a period in my time as, head of communications for a brand where I was like, should I have left editorial? I'm not sure. But in the end, I am happy I left editorial, because now even the publishing industry is going through quite an evolution. And in fact, communications is going through an evolution now too. I think we're all at a real crossroads of change in a lot of different fields.
So now you're at Donna Karen. So tell me about the stage that you joined, and then also DKNY PR girl. First, I was 11 when this started. So I want to know a little bit more about you being in that experience and what it really told, like what it started and the impact it had.
Okay, so when I joined Donna Karen, it was, brace yourself, it was 1998.
When I was born.
Okay, you were born, right. And I started as a very junior position in accessories. So I took my accessories experience from editorial and transferred it over to get this job in PR. And, my 17 years there sort of worked my way up the ladder of communications and taking on the luxury brand, which was Donna Karen New York at the time, and working in what we used to call traditional PR. So that meant, everyday relationships with editors at magazines, which is where I came from. Everyday relationships with journalists at newspapers. There was no online back then, right? So it was very different. Celebrity dressing for award season, producing fashion shows. So all that sort of glitzy glam stuff was part of the job, but then also the not so glamorous stuff, which was packing boxes and dealing with sample returns and packing garment bags. And there was a lot of hustle to it too. So fast forward to 2009, I'm at that point senior vice president of global communications, a full-blown job, a very large team around the world. And we decide we're going to embark on this new platform to fashion that they call Twitter. We had a Facebook page, but no one really understood what Twitter was. But we knew that it was going to be sort of a conversation. And me coming from a PR background and sort of my entire job was protecting Donna's voice. I said, well, if the Twitter handle's at Donna Karen, people are going to assume she's speaking. And that's going to be a disaster, because who's writing that and who's approving that and how is that going to happen? So we were kind of like trying to think about what was the solution for that. And it was Gossip Girl season 2 at the time. And I was like, well, why can't it just be like an anonymous character, like Gossip Girl? Like, why can't we just call it DKNY PR girl, and then we can have it be like a fashion illustration and no one needs to know who she is. It doesn't matter. It's just like pretend. And everyone was like, oh, that's cool. And I was like, yeah, it'll be like paper dolls. Like, we can dress her up, we can change her outfit, we can make her go places. And legal, our general counsel, we had to run the idea past them. And they were like, okay, that's cool, but we're concerned if multiple people have the account credentials to log in. So, Aliza, you're going to be the only one allowed to tweet. I was like, okay, no idea what that means.
Yeah.
So I just started like initiation by fire. And when I started, I had zero intention of making it me. But when you have consistency in a voice, people start to catch on that it's always the same person. And I think what I paid very close attention to from a marketing perspective is not so much how the following was growing, but more so what kind of content generated engagement. So was my tweet about doing a fitting with Celeb X for the Golden Globes going to generate a greater response than me announcing that handbags are 20% off? Answer, yes. So I started to become a little bit of a guru with regard to content and how to tell the story of the Donna Karen, New York, and DKNY brands through the lens of a PR girl working in New York City, and all the glam and behind the scenes stuff. So very fly on the wall experience, and very focused on storytelling versus selling. And that was really the secret to success. So the account grew, and 2 years later, it was 2011. That was when Instagram launched, by the way. The account on Twitter is at 380,000 people. There's a ton of fashion brands who have now come on the platform. DKNY was really the first. Yeah. And people were just obsessed with finding out who she was. And Teen Vogue had called me as me in my job, and they said, Aliza, we'd love to invite DKNY PR girl to come speak at our fashion summit. And I was like, well, she's anonymous. I'm not sure if she can do that. I'll get back to you. So I went into my boss, Patty, and I said, honestly, like, we were the first. It would be great if we can maybe think about like pulling back the veil on this and be able to speak at a conference like this and talk about the strategy and what we did. Yeah. And so we decided to reveal me as the person behind the Twitter handle. And I did that through a behind the scenes of Fashion Week video, which is on YouTube. And what happened from that point was I knew that the Twitter account was really big, but I didn't quite know what the impact would be once I revealed myself as that person. So from a media standpoint, it was over 230 million impressions of this news. So then all of a sudden it's like, you feel really naked, right? Because I had a very kind of snarky personality online. It was really easy hiding behind a computer, hiding behind a fashion illustration. And then all of a sudden it's like, oh, okay, but they know that Aliza said that. So when I started to see people tweeting back with my name versus DKNY PR girl, I felt a different level of responsibility as far as the content. Still trying to maintain that sort of brand voice that I had established, but with certainly a degree of caution. And so that really led to an editor at Grand Central who reached out, called me one day and said, I follow you on Twitter. I read your blog because I had a blog. I was on Instagram. I was, on every platform, even Weibo, posting in English for our Chinese market. And she's like, I think there's a book in here somewhere. And I was like, I can't write a book. I have a full-time job. I have 2 little kids. Like, there's no way. And what would I even write about? And she's like, well, why don't you tell this story? And I was like, I'm not going to write a book that my company owns. And then, so I passed. And then she was really relentless. And when I realized that so many people were DMing me on Twitter asking for career advice, how they could break into fashion, how they can be a publicist, how could they have this job, and even other just general career advice outside of fashion, I realized I could write a career mentorship, and then it would be all worth it. So that's what I did, and that's what Leave Your Mark is. It's a career mentorship.
Yeah. So, okay, before we get into the book, what have you learned from Donna Karen, from the leadership particularly? You mentioned Patty and then Donna Karen herself.
Yeah.
What did you learn that you now bring with you today in leading great teams, large teams, and everything?
I think mentorship is a very big part of it. I think that I was always supported, and not just me. Everyone who worked there was encouraged to be creative, encouraged to bring ideas to the table. It didn't really matter. Donna never cared like where the idea was coming from. Like we had this amazing guy who sat at the reception desk on our floor. His name is Leroy. And he was an aspiring designer. So he would sketch stuff up and then show Donna, and she would totally let him put it into work. So it was a really creative, very organic kind of almost Woodstocky environment where it just felt like you could run with your ideas. So the amount of support that everyone got, the amount of empowerment that Patty, especially as our boss, and she was really the matriarch of the team, the amount of sort of like lifting up of others that she did was really the example that I followed with my teams after that.
Yeah, and I think that is so important. Even in companies today, even those who are in the brainstorming room don't feel confident enough to speak their ideas. And I think that's just so telling of the culture of at Donna Karen and just in general. I think that's amazing. So I love that. Now, tell me why you left Donna Karen. It was 17 years, and already 17 years is it's a great time at a company, and you obviously loved it, it sounds like. So yeah, tell me kind of the next steps after Donna Karen.
So I stayed there that long. I think it's really rare for people to stay at companies that long anymore. I stayed there that long because every time I felt like I was getting stagnant, something would happen. Like someone would leave and I'd get more responsibility or something. It just kept on evolving. So I kept on feeling like I was always growing, which is why I stayed there. Why I left, so my book came out in May 2015, and I had no intention of leaving. The company was totally supportive of it, of course approved it, etc. But all of a sudden in June, we got a new CEO, and Patty, my direct boss and mentor, left the company. And then a month later, Donna retired. So I was left there with my team. And by the way, everyone on our team had been there many, many years, a lot of people over a decade. So it was very much a family. So with those two sort of matriarchs gone, I felt like the soul had been ripped out. And even though they brought in great new creative directors and it was like a fresh new thing, it just felt like, I don't know, I think in college, with a science major, you're never quite done studying. And I always used to find what I used to say, like a good stopping point. Like I feel good about stopping right now. So I kind of recognized that it was probably a good stopping point for me to sort of wrap 17 years up with a bow. So I decided to produce the new creative director's first fashion show, which would be my last fashion show. And I basically gave them like 5 months notice. And I was like, listen, I'm going to go do my book press. I'm going to totally work on everything you need me to work on, but I think I'll leave the end of the year. And that's what we did. So it was a great ending to a really wonderful experience.
Yeah, I love it. So I listened to your podcast where your sister interviewed you. So I know a little bit more about you. And one thing I want to ask is, you said you're not much of a planner and you really live what's in front of you, you achieve, and you make sure what's in front of you is successful, and then you move on to the next thing. So I'm wondering your thoughts, because I've talked to other guests and they're big on goal setting and writing down your goals and kind of working towards that 5 years, 1 year, whatever it is. So I want to hear your perspective on this like balance of not planning out and planning for the next 5 years versus just goal setting.
I think we are specifically at a time right now in the age of COVID where you could have had the best laid plans and they're all out the window. So I've always been this way. I have never been someone who wants to think 5 years down the road, because I think that in a way, goal setting that far in advance makes you sometimes feel like a constant failure. Because if you're not sort of ticking off boxes and achieving, as you go to reach that goal, like, especially as a young person out of college, you've never worked. You have no idea how long it takes to achieve certain levels of things. So my mantra has always been like, what's my immediate goal? Like, where do I want to be in a month from now? Where do I want to be in next week? What do I want to do tomorrow? So I've always made it more, I would say, digestible bites, like bite-sized goals for me to be like, what can I do? And actually, the Leave Your Mark podcast is a perfect example, because I never planned to do a podcast, right? I had written this book 5 years ago. The fact that it's still around and people are posting it every day is a surprise, right? You can't plan for that. You have no idea what's going to happen when you write a book. And I wanted to do something creative again. And the thought of writing a book, I was like, oh, that's a really big project. Like, I think it's going to take too long. I don't know if I have the patience. And a friend of mine who's an influencer who has a podcast was like, oh, do you want to do my podcast? And I was like, sure. I didn't even listen to podcasts. And then she randomly was like, well, why don't you have one? And I was like, should I have a podcast? And then all of a sudden I was like, I'm going to make a podcast. So I started Googling how to make a podcast. And you start to think like, okay, should I like how long should I research this for? Like how buttoned up should I be? And I think a lot of times this pursuit of perfection paralyzes people to prepare and prepare and prepare. And then all of a sudden it's like years later, and guess what? Somebody who had the guts has already come out with your idea, because guess what? They did it, and no, it's not perfect, but guess what? It's out there. So I'm very much of the mentality that you have to start somewhere, and it doesn't have to be perfect, and you're going to evolve as you go. But to like wait for perfection, you'll never do anything. So I think that's hand in hand with the goal settings of these like macro plans, because I mean, you'll edit that document, that 5-year plan, till you're blue in the face, and it'll never be the same as it is ultimately.
I think there are so many lessons that you just within that answer, but I think one thing is, well, one is just like the idea of waiting for perfection and like just waiting for that, because it's so true. I think so many people be like, no, it's not perfect. I can't do it yet. I can't do it. But you learn as you go, so it's okay. And then, so tell me a little bit about the idea of failure. And you almost have to give yourself permission to fail and what you can learn from it. So talk a little bit about that.
So I wrote an article about this for Forbes. So in that 10 months that I left Donna Karen before I joined Alice and Olivia, I went back into corporate after 10 months. So during the 10 months of consulting, I kept track of all of my leads on an Excel document. So I would keep track of who I was networking with, who introduced me, because I felt like, okay, if I get a consulting gig from someone's introduction, I want to know who to thank. Right? And when you network as much as I do, like you really, like, I don't even remember who I spoke to last week. Like it becomes this blur. So I, with over 20 years in fashion, I have a really incredible network of very high level people. I was meeting with all these CEOs and meeting with all these people, and I think it's important to be really honest with yourself about your progress. So, you always think of like, when you're like behind a school bus or a bus driver, and it's like, how am I doing? And it's that number behind. So I kind of have that for myself. It's like, how am I doing? Like, here's this really impressive spreadsheet, but how am I really doing? Like, what have I really accomplished? And at 10 months, I sort of did a gut check, and I was like, you know what? Yes, I know a lot of fabulous people, people respond to my emails, people pick up my phone calls, people are willing to meet, but have I really built something sustainable? And the answer was no. So in this article for Forbes, which was entitled How You Know You're Not Meant to Be an Entrepreneur, I'm very honest about my sort of synopsis of, okay, I tried this, but I'm calling it a failure. And I'm calling for myself now to pivot. And maybe I'm supposed to work in corporate. And there's nothing bad about working for a company. Like, I think that's the other thing. Like, entrepreneurship has become very trendy in a way, right? Yeah. So, and certainly now, you know, with the job market the way it is, I think it'll even be more so. But there's nothing wrong with working and trying to build someone else's vision. Like, you can have an important seat at that table too. So that is really, I think when you're willing to say that you failed, especially publicly, it gives you permission to start over. I think people who are embarrassed about failure, who try to cover up failure, it becomes this really exhausting game of like trying to pretend you're someone you're not. So I think that, you know, you never want to talk about failure with a core competency. Like in Leave Your Mark, I speak about like if you're like trying to be an accountant, you're not going to talk about the fact that like you failed calculus or something related to like the core skills of your job. But there's something I think to be said for acknowledging defeat and then trying to imagine what that pivot looks like.
Yeah. I think it's so true, and I think it's such a valuable lesson for honestly anyone, but especially me starting off a career, but really anyone, giving them the permission to fail and knowing that we'll learn so much from it that we'll take with us beyond.
Yeah. And also there's not like one path for people. Yeah. There's like a lot of turns.
Yeah.
So, you know.
Yeah. And so I think one thing that's also very cool in that story is the idea where you were writing things down kind of as you went on. You weren't, like, usually people say, oh, I'll remember that I met that person, or I'll remember, but that really doesn't happen, and it's easy to forget. So is that something that you've kind of taken with you even now? Just the idea.
Oh, I have it right this second. It's my networking Excel sheet.
I love it. And then also I heard, okay, before we get into the final questions, I honestly can talk to you for hours. It's so interesting. So there's one thing where I read that you, similarly, where you keep track of things in the moment, is the idea of your goal folder.
Yes.
So talk a little bit about the goal folder. Yeah.
So working in a corporate structure, you know, you have year-end reviews, and I realized early on that you're not going to get promoted for doing your job. You're going to get promoted for going above and beyond your job. And we all do, you know, when you're working full time, there's a ton of stuff that gets done during the day, and there's a ton of wins and there's a ton of losses. And it's equally hard to keep track of both. The losses you probably remember more. But so I started to realize, you know, at year-end review, Donna Karen was part of LVMH, and we had a very formal review structure. It was like this online form. And every time it came that time, I'm like, oh, it was always such a burden to remember what we accomplished. And then when I would start to dig into it, I'm like, oh my God, I totally forgot about that. Oh my God, this happened. And it became this like guessing game of like, will I remember everything enough to convince my boss that I deserve promotion?
Yeah.
So I started just printing stuff out as I went. Like, you know, if we got the cover of Vogue, I would print out, you know, the cover of Vogue, put it in the goal folder. So by the end of the year, by the time it came time to like put that all into this review document, I would have this folder of like, here's all the stuff I did. Yeah. And it just, honestly, it's just more efficient than having to think about what happened, you know, 10 months ago.
Yeah. And I'm sure for each one, you're giving way more detail and you're describing it better, and rather than, oh, I remember I did this, but, you know, like you kind of leave out some important things. So I think I'm going to use that for sure. I think that's great.
Or even like, you know, if, you know, we had tons of vendors. So if I was negotiating a deal and I was able to, let's say, get talent for, 20% less than my budget. I'm not going to remember that. So I would print out stuff like that, print out the email that, confirms that I got that person 20% less and put that in the goal folder so that I would remember, and then maybe even mapping a pattern of multiple deals that came in under budget and then making that more of a feature.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's great. So what is some advice that you can give not only to a recent grad, but also to women and females? Because there's definitely a difference. And I'm not sure where I read this, but females almost have this habit where they see a job post and they see, okay, these skills are required in order to apply. And women typically think, okay, I have this one, but I don't have these three, and I have this one, so I'm not going to apply. Whereas men, I think, are more like, oh, I have two of them, that's enough. So how do you balance that, and just what advice do you have to attack that?
So first of all, I recommend to all your listeners that they read the article I just wrote for Forbes, which is geared toward the graduating class of 2020.
Yeah, it's a great article.
Especially advice for right this second.
Right.
And I think that with regard to the job profiles, we're at a time right now where people are not going to be as willing to have you learn on the job. So when you start looking for jobs, my friend Lauren McGoodwin has the book coming out called Power Moves, coming out May 19th. And she recommends that you print out 5 job descriptions for the same type of job in, one industry, and look across them and start circling the skills that are common among those 5 job postings, and making sure that your resume reflects those keywords. And also that you have those skills. And if you don't have those skills, take an online course or figure out how to get them. Because a lot of this stuff is self-taught, right? Especially everything in digital. So I think it's important to fill in those blanks, but also to remember that it's maybe less about having every single skill than it is about figuring out how to use your network in a really powerful way to be able to have someone serve you up as a possible candidate versus the black hole of applying online, because there is that hidden job market. Jobs that are posted online most of the time are filled, but legally they have to post them online because everyone's an equal opportunity employer. So you kind of have to do the back end due diligence to really understand how to get yourself seen.
Yeah, no, I think that's very important. And even printing out the job descriptions, I think one thing that's valuable is you almost learn the language that they're using. And then
and by the way, a lot of the big companies are feeding your resume into a system.
Yeah.
So the computer needs to see those matched words, or you're not going to surface.
Yeah, so true. Interesting. Okay, so Aliza, this has been so great. So I want to end off with 2 questions. So one, I know you've ended off some of your podcasts with this, but Aliza, how do you want to leave your mark?
So what is most satisfying to me, truly, is paying forward what I've learned and supporting others. I'm really kind of, doing what I feel is my calling. And yes, I still consult, and that's, how I pay the bills. But as far as the work that's really gratifying, it is, people reading the book and people listening to the podcast, because I take a lot of pride and I put a lot of thought into the kind of advice that I want to put out there, and certainly in my Forbes column as well. And I mean, for me, helping people land their dream jobs is really how I want to leave my mark. I mean, that is truly what makes me happy.
Yeah, I love it. And you seem like such a great, helpful, even the way that you were so responsive to me, I was like, oh my God, I'm so excited. This is going to be great. So
I think, everyone needs to have a door opened for them.
Yeah.
And I think if everyone, especially everyone who's listening, like, think about how you can help other people. I always say this, the most successful people I know, the first thing they say is, how can I help you?
Yeah.
And I think that's a really powerful question to ask.
I love it. Okay, so last question that I ask everyone on SheLeads is, what is a fun or weird talent that you have that no one else really knows about? So I'll go first. I'll go first.
Go first.
I'll go first. So I can throw grapes or blueberries into my mouth. Okay?
Do it.
And it's better with a partner, but it's just me, so here we go. Okay, so here's a grape. Okay, we'll see how this goes. There you go.
Very impressive. I definitely cannot do that.
Thank you.
So I'm pretty public about like my hobbies and skills. So like I'm someone who can cut hair. I can do makeup. I do my own hair color. As far as like talent that probably no one knows, I used to be pretty avid ice skater and skier, and I stopped it years ago, but those are definitely things that I never talk about, nor does anyone know that I can do. And I always joke, and you probably heard this on the podcast, about how like I'm not good at like summer sports, but I'm really good at winter sports.
That's great.
So I don't know if that's like a legitimate thing, but that's it. And
I love it.
I don't know. I think I don't know. I'm pretty open on social, so there's not much that people don't know.
Yeah, no, that's a great one. I love it. So,
Yeah.
So Aliza, I just want to thank you so much for coming on the show. I'm excited for especially people my age to just hear this and learn from you. And just go to your podcast and listen to these incredible episodes because I've loved them. And I'm going to get your book very soon because I need to read it. And so
Great.
Thank you.
And I will tell you, there is a book coming out, and actually she's going to do my podcast next week. Alexandra Carter is an award-winning Columbia law professor who teaches negotiation. And her book is called Ask for More.
Yeah.
And it's 10 steps to negotiate. And she actually trains the UN. So that, I think, is definitely going to be an episode worth listening to because women need to know how to negotiate.
Definitely. I think that's such an important skill, too. So Thank you. Yeah. Okay,
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Aliza.
Take care. Bye.